I never had a single reason to check my husband's pockets or monitor his phone during 8 years of marriage. We built an interior architecture firm together, shared a quiet suburban home, and talked about starting a family over late night dinners. My life felt completely safe. But on a freezing Thursday afternoon in November, while taking Julian's damp charcoal trench coat to the hallway closet after he stepped into his office, my hand brushed against a stiff paper hidden inside the inner lining. I pulled it out expecting a client's business card or a dry cleaning receipt. Instead, I unfolded a 2-page residential lease for a luxury studio apartment just 6 blocks away from our office. My pulse spiked instantly. I couldn't breathe. The primary lessee was listed as Julian Vance, but the secondary occupant was a woman named Elena Vance, a surname I had never heard in my entire life. Attached to the back of the lease was an official deposit receipt for 4 months of upfront rent paid in cash, alongside a heavy brass key fob stamped with Unit 3B. I stood completely motionless in the dimly lit entryway, holding the paper as the grandfather clock ticked softly in the living room. I didn't scream. I didn't drop the document. My throat simply tightened until the air in my lungs turned to ice. I forced myself to slow down. Reacting emotionally right then would only give him time to erase his digital paper trail or craft a plausible story. Therefore, I pulled out my phone, snapped high-resolution photographs of every single clause on the contract, and slipped the original document back into his coat pocket. When Julian walked into the kitchen 20 minutes later, smelling of damp wool and cold air, I was standing by the counter pouring hot tea into 2 porcelain mugs. He walked over and wrapped his arms around my waist from behind, pressing a soft kiss against my neck. It was the exact same tender gesture he had performed every day for 8 years. Nothing made sense anymore. When I casually turned around and asked him how the site inspection for our downtown commercial project had gone that morning, he looked me straight in the eyes without a second of delay and lied. He claimed the city planning board was dragging their feet on electrical permits, which would require him to stay late at the office every Tuesday and Thursday evening for the next month to review updated blueprints. His delivery was seamless. There was no hesitation, no blinking, no nervous twitch. The effortless perfection of his lie terrified me far more than the physical lease itself. I was looking at a total stranger wearing my husband's face. Later that night, after waiting for his breathing to settle into the deep rhythm of sleep, I slipped out of bed, grabbed my laptop, and locked myself in the master bathroom. I sat down on the cold marble floor as tears finally spilled over my eyelashes. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely type. Everything I had built over the last decade, my home, my business, my marriage, had dissolved into thin air in less than 5 minutes. I felt completely powerless. But as I wiped my face under the dim light of my screen, staring at the photo of that lease, I made a silent choice. I wasn't going to break down. I was going to find out the truth. The rain outside our windows showed no sign of stopping the following morning. Sitting at the kitchen island with a cup of cold tea, I knew I couldn't just sit there and pretend nothing had happened. If I wanted to protect my professional license and my sanity, I needed concrete proof of what Julian was doing behind my back. Therefore, I called an independent private investigator whose details I found through an encrypted legal form, agreeing to meet him in a quiet diner on the outskirts of town 3 hours later. I brought my personal laptop and our firm's basic public registration documents, believing that paying a professional to track Julian's movements would give me the upper hand I desperately required. It was the biggest mistake of my life. The private investigator turned out to be an unscrupulous mercenary who took my $5,000 cash retainer, skimmed through the papers I showed him, and made a quiet phone call to Julian less than 40 minutes after I walked out the diner door. By the time I arrived back at our home office that afternoon, my administrative master password to our corporate banking portal had been revoked. I tried to log in 3 times, but the screen just flashed red. My personal company credit card was abruptly declined when I tried to order routine project supplies online. I was completely locked out. He was 3 steps ahead of me. Panicking and realizing that Julian now knew someone was actively digging into his affairs, I had to physically force my hands to stop shaking when he walked through the front door at 5 o'clock. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't drop his keys. Instead, he casually placed his leather briefcase on the hall table, walked into the kitchen, and gently placed a heavy manila folder directly in front of me on the granite counter. Inside were copies of three major material purchasing invoices bearing my digitized signature, showing wire transfers totaling over $80,000 from our business account to an offshore supplier I had never heard of in my life. Julian leaned against the counter with his arms crossed, looking at me with a terrifyingly calm, pitying expression. He softly asked me why I had been authorizing unvetted vendor payouts without consulting him first. He was actively framing me in real time. He was placing the paper trail of his secret debts squarely onto my shoulders while pretending to be the concerned, protective business partner who was simply trying to keep our firm solvent. I felt sick to my stomach. Instead of screaming or starting a fight that would only validate his claim that I was losing my mind, I forced a tight smile and claimed those transfers were preliminary retainers for our upcoming showcase project. My voice trembled slightly, but I held my ground. The lie hung heavily between us in the quiet kitchen. We both knew the illusion of our 8-year marriage was dead, yet we stood there smiling, locked in a silent, suffocating game of chicken where the first person to flinch would lose everything. That night, knowing that my digital access was completely severed and that my husband was preparing to sacrifice me to save himself, I reached a point of sheer desperation. I waited until 2 in the morning, when the house was dead silent, to break into Julian's locked briefcase using a pair of metal tweezers and a heavy hairpin from my dressing table. My hands were freezing, the cold metal slipping from my fingers as I listened for any sound of movement from the bedroom down the hall. My heart was beating like a hammer against my ribs. When the brass latch finally clicked open, I reached inside and pulled out a personal ledger filled with handwritten dates, account numbers, and transaction codes that detailed every single dollar he had funneled out of our business over the last 12 months. But just as I pulled out my phone to photograph the pages under the dim light of the desk lamp, the heavy hallway door slowly swung open. Julian was standing in the dark doorway, watching me silently with his arms folded across his chest. The cold floorboards of the hallway creaked softly as Julian stepped into the home office, closing the heavy wooden door behind him with a quiet, unsettling finality. Standing in the dim light with the unlocked leather briefcase in my hands, I froze. My breath hitched in my throat, a sudden wave of physical panic making my knees tremble. I expected him to raise his voice, to snatch the binder from my fingers, or to demand an immediate explanation. Instead, he reached out with a calm, unhurried motion, gently took the papers from my grip, and set them back on the desk without a single flicker of anger in his eyes. He sat down in the heavy leather armchair, looked up at me under the low yellow light of the desk lamp, and sighed. It was an expression of profound, weary disappointment, the look of a man burdened by an ungrateful partner. He softly asked me why I had spent the last 3 weeks treating him like an enemy in our own home. The sheer, chilling audacity of his demeanor made my stomach churn. Tears of frustration finally spilled over my eyelashes as I demanded to know about Unit 3B, the name Elena Vance on the residential contract, and the missing $80,000 from our firm's operating accounts. Julian didn't flinch. He ran a hand over his face, leaned back in the chair, and began to lay out a story so meticulously constructed, so grounded in half-truths, that it made my head spin. He claimed that Elena Vance was his estranged half-sister from his father's second marriage, a relative he had kept hidden to protect our family from her severe, spiraling financial debts. He insisted that the studio apartment was a temporary safe house he was paying for out of brotherly obligation, and that the unauthorized financial transfers were short-term personal loans he had underwritten to keep aggressive private lenders away from our doorstep. He spoke with such quiet conviction, such gentle concern for my well-being, that for a terrifying minute, I actually questioned my own reality. And I almost believed him. Part of me desperately wanted to take his hand, to apologize, and to accept his explanation, because accepting his lie meant my 8-year marriage was still real. But as the first cold light of dawn filtered through the window blinds, I asked him to log into his personal bank portal and trading accounts right then and there to show me the paper trail backing up his claim. The mask slipped instantly. The gentle, protective husband vanished behind a wall of cold, condescending arrogance. Julian stood up, closed his briefcase with a loud click, and flatly refused. He told me that if I couldn't trust his word after 8 years of marriage, our partnership was effectively over. He warned me that taking this dispute to our board of directors or an external attorney would destroy our firm's reputation, liquidate our assets, and leave both of us completely bankrupt before the end of the month. He was turning my own livelihood into a weapon against me. By that afternoon, the suffocating weight of my isolation reached a breaking point. I sat alone in my parked car in a gravel lot near the industrial harbor, staring blankly at the dark gray water as cold rain tapped against the windshield. The private investigator had betrayed me for a higher payout. My administrative access to our corporate accounts was locked. Our firm's invoices bore digitized versions of my signature on illegal wire transfers, and my husband was holding my professional license hostage. I couldn't breathe. Nothing made sense anymore. I buried my face in the steering wheel and sobbed until my ribs ached, feeling completely outmaneuvered and utterly defenseless. Every exit door had been locked from the outside. I was sitting at the absolute bottom of a pit Julian had spent months digging for me, contemplating whether it was even possible to fight back when every piece of physical evidence pointed toward my own guilt. Just as the sun dipped below the industrial skyline and I was preparing to turn the key in the ignition to drive back to a house that felt like a prison, my phone vibrated in my lap. It was a secondary, encrypted message from an unlisted address. Attached was a direct file export from our firm's external accounting server, sent by our senior bookkeeper, Marcus, who had quietly noticed Julian's irregular transaction logs 2 weeks prior. Attached to the bottom of the ledger was a verified bank affidavit. It proved that Elena Vance was not a half-sister or a human being at all. It was the primary registration pseudonym of an offshore cryptocurrency brokerage firm through which Julian had been liquidating our business assets to cover his own personal catastrophic trading losses. He wasn't hiding a sister. He was hiding his own ruin. The cold harbor air blew through the cracked window of my parked car, carrying the sharp metallic smell of salt water and rusted machinery from the surrounding shipping docks. I sat motionless in the driver's seat, holding my phone with trembling hands as I read the verified bank affidavit sent by our senior bookkeeper over and over again until the words blurred into meaningless black lines on the screen. The truth was far more terrifying than a simple romantic betrayal or a quiet second life hidden in the city center. Elena Vance was not a woman, a mistress, or a secret relative. It was the registered pseudonym of a high-risk offshore cryptocurrency brokerage firm operating out of an unlisted financial holding account, a firm Julian had been using to execute massive, leveraged margin trades that had gone catastrophically wrong over the preceding 8 months. He had not leased Unit 3B to start a secret family or hide a lover, but to set up a private, off-grid trading center equipped with high-speed encrypted servers away from the watchful eyes of our firm's accounting staff and our primary corporate bank auditors. As his trading losses multiplied and the private brokerage began threatening him with immediate asset liquidation, Julian had panicked, utilizing digitized images of my signature copied directly from our firm's master architectural contracts to authorize secondary corporate loans and wire transfers to cover his margin calls. The luxury apartment 6 blocks away was the physical origin point where every fraudulent transaction bearing my name had been uploaded and executed, carefully engineered so that if the financial authorities ever investigated the firm, every single thread of criminal liability would point directly to my office desk. A wave of intense physical nausea hit me so suddenly that I had to push open the car door and lean out into the freezing wind, struggling to catch my breath as the full, suffocating horror of my situation washed over me. I had dedicated 8 years of my life to building our architectural firm, sacrificing weekends, sleep, and personal health to establish a reputation for absolute integrity in our industry, only to realize that the man who shared my bed had been calculatingly converting my life's work into his personal financial shield. I was completely trapped in a cage of his design. The private investigator I had hired had already alerted Julian to my suspicions. My administrative bank access was locked, my corporate credit lines were frozen, and any public accusation I made without a court-admissible forensic paper trail would be dismissed as the irrational panic of a disgruntled partner. I pulled myself back into the car, locking the doors against the howling wind, and sank into the absolute lowest point of my adult life, burying my face in my hands as heavy, silent tears soaked through my sleeves. The crushing isolation of that moment felt like a physical weight on my chest, a dark void where every choice I made seemed destined to end in my professional destruction and personal imprisonment. I spent 2 hours sitting in that deserted gravel lot while the sun dipped below the industrial skyline, watching the streetlights flick on one by one along the docks, feeling utterly defeated and completely stripped of hope, contemplating whether it was even possible to rebuild a life from a foundation so thoroughly shattered. Just as the cold darkness settled over the harbor and I was preparing to turn the key in the ignition to drive back to a house that no longer felt like a home, a secondary notification chimed softly from my encrypted messaging app. It was a direct follow-up message from our senior bookkeeper, Marcus, who had been quietly compiling internal server logs from his remote workstation after realizing Julian had tried to alter the firm's main general ledger earlier that morning. Marcus revealed that while Julian had successfully locked my administrative portal, he had forgotten that our primary server kept a permanent, unalterable hardware backup log on a physical hard drive stored in our studio's off-site archive vault, a vault key to which only I held the master physical copy. For the first time in 3 weeks, the suffocating fog of despair lifted just enough for me to see a single, narrow path forward, providing the exact physical key required to turn the tables before Julian could execute his final exit strategy. The cold rain continued to beat a rhythmic pattern against the tall, reinforced glass windows of our firm's 10th floor conference room as 8 equity partners, 2 primary legal advisors, and our chief financial auditor took their seats around the heavy mahogany table. It was barely 8 o'clock on a freezing Friday morning, but the atmosphere inside the room was thick with unspoken tension. Julian sat at the far end of the executive table, impeccably groomed in his tailored dark blue suit, holding a silver pen between his fingers with a casual, polished posture that radiated supreme confidence. He had spent the previous evening calling every board member individually, laying the groundwork for what he intended to be a decisive, binding vote to strip me of my administrative voting rights and place me on an involuntary medical leave of absence. He cleared his throat softly, standing up to adjust his jacket button, and began to speak in a low, practiced tone that carried the exact measure of sorrowful restraint required to convince a room full of cautious businessmen. He presented a slick digital slideshow on the main wall display, walking the board through a series of flagged material invoices and unverified offshore wire transfers, claiming with a heavy sigh that my recent personal exhaustion and erratic behavior had led to severe financial negligence. He looked over at me with an expression of performative pity, offering the board a sanitized narrative that portrayed him as the heartbroken husband attempting to save both his wife's dignity and the firm's commercial reputation before federal regulators intervened. Not a single person in the room raised a voice. The senior partners simply took notes, clearly inclined to accept his version of reality to protect the firm's multi-million-dollar commercial pipeline. I sat at the opposite end of the mahogany table, my hands folded neatly on top of a plain black leather folder, watching him perform with a cold, absolute stillness. I did not interrupt him. I didn't cry. I simply allowed him to paint his illusion until he finally sat down and looked at the board members for their official assent. When the managing director turned to me and asked if I had any formal statement to submit before they put the motion for my suspension to a binding show of hands, I stood up slowly, pulled a stack of verified hardware audit logs from my folder, and walked around the table to place a bound copy directly in front of our chief legal counsel and our senior auditor. I walked the room through the raw, unedited server metadata extracted directly from our firm's off-site archive vault late the previous night. I pointed to the exact hardware identification codes, time-stamped IP logs, and digital certificate footprints that proved every single offshore transfer sent to the entity named Elena Vance had originated from Julian's personal laptop, while connected to the private wireless router registered to Unit 3B. I handed the auditor the official bank affidavit confirming that Elena Vance was not a vendor, contractor, or relative, but an unlisted margin trading account through which Julian had been systematically liquidating our firm's cash reserves to cover a sequence of catastrophic personal cryptocurrency trading losses totaling over $600,000. The silence that fell over the conference room was sudden and absolute. Julian's face drained of every trace of color, his effortless composure disintegrating in a matter of seconds as he fumbled with his laptop, desperately trying to claim the server logs were fabricated or corrupted by a remote malware attack. But our lead legal counsel held up a single hand, stopping Julian mid-sentence, his eyes darting back and forth between the verified digital signatures and the physical bank affidavit on his desk. The auditor leaned across the table, picked up his pen, and quietly informed the board that based on the primary server timestamps, an immediate freeze on all corporate assets was legally mandatory, alongside a formal referral to state financial investigators for corporate fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement. Julian sat frozen in his leather chair, staring blankly at the glass wall as the senior partners slowly closed their folders and stood up without saying a single word to him. The trap he had spent months constructing had snapped shut on his own life. The formal corporate dissolution and asset recovery process unfolded over the following 3 months with quiet, devastating efficiency. Armed with the unedited server hardware logs, the physical archive drives, and the verified bank affidavit, our firm's legal team successfully froze every secondary account tied to Julian's name before he could move any remaining capital out of the country. The State Financial Crimes Division initiated a formal criminal prosecution for corporate fraud, wire embezzlement, and identity theft, leaving his defense team with zero technical grounds to contest the charges. The board of directors unanimously voted to remove him permanently from all corporate filings, and I successfully petitioned the Chancery Court for full receiver ownership over our interior architecture firm, liquidating Julian's remaining equity stakes to fully restore the company's operating accounts and cover our outstanding client liabilities. On a crisp Tuesday afternoon in early spring, while I was reviewing the final blueprint approval signatures for a major downtown commercial renovation project, my assistant softly knocked on my office door to inform me that Julian was in the lobby, requesting a brief private conversation before his formal plea hearing. I agreed to see him, not out of lingering malice or a desire to gloat over his ruin, but to close that chapter of my life with absolute clarity. When he walked into my office, the polished, impeccably groomed executive who had lied to my face in our kitchen 8 months ago was completely unrecognizable. In his place stood an exhausted, hollowed-out man, wearing a faded charcoal suit that hung loosely on his shoulders, his posture crushed beneath the inevitable weight of his impending prison sentence. He sat across from my desk and spoke in a hushed, trembling voice, attempting to frame his actions as a tragic, desperate attempt to protect our firm's long-term financial independence from bad trading debts, rather than a calculated sociopathic betrayal of my personal trust. He spent 15 minutes begging me to submit a character reference letter to the presiding judge, asking if there was any remaining thread of our 8-year marriage that still held value in my heart. I listened to his desperate speech in complete, unyielding silence, looking at him without a single trace of anger or hostility, but with the cold, clear perspective of a survivor who had pulled herself out of the dark. I softly told him that mercy was a privilege reserved for those who made honest human mistakes, not for predators who calculatedly weaponized their spouse's reputation to save themselves from their own vices. I quietly slid his file across the mahogany desk, opened my office door, and wished him luck with his legal team. He walked away. I never saw him again. And that was the last lie he ever told me. Stepping out of the studio building that evening into the sharp, rain-washed air of the city, watching the streetlights illuminate the wet sidewalks below the towering skyscrapers I had helped design, I felt a deep, profound sense of peace settle permanently into my chest. Rebuilding my life and business from the shattered ruins of a betrayed marriage was agonizing, but losing my dignity and freedom to a comfortable lie would have been an absolute tragedy. True strength does not come from burning everything down in a theatrical explosion of rage, but from having the quiet, unwavering patience to gather every truth, stand firm in your integrity, and let the justice you built piece by piece dismantle the illusion around those who try to destroy you. When someone demonstrates that they view your life as collateral damage for their own safety, the ultimate victory is not matching their cruelty, but stepping completely out of their shadow and building a world where they no longer have a voice. If you found yourself in a situation where the person you trusted most was quietly orchestrating your financial ruin behind closed doors, would you have waited to gather physical proof? or confronted them the very moment you found that lease? Share your thoughts and personal stories in the comments below, and do not forget to subscribe for more deep personal stories of resilience and truth.